Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program comes to you from the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. A word about CESPA, it's an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore. We tackle issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments, and this program is part of that effort. Now, frankly, this episode was planned a week ago, and I was supposed to discuss the US-backed initiative to normalize relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, leading perhaps to recognition by Riyadh of Israel. That issue, obviously, as we all know, has been overtaken by the war unfolding in Gaza and southern Israel after Harkat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, or as we call it, Hamas, fighters launched an early morning offensive against Israel, which took Israel and the entire world by surprise. Hamas not only targeted Israeli cities as far away as Tel Aviv with long-range rockets, but also breached the Israeli defensive line around Gaza and attacked Israeli security forces' troops, killing many and capturing dozens of them. According to Hamas, they have 100 military personnel in custody, which are now in Gaza. They also took control of a kibbutz in Karmia and spread out in the cities of Ashkelon and Siderat. Fighting is still going on. Israel has called in 100,000 reservists, and the overall force dedicated to dealing with Hamas and Islamic Jihad fighters is reaching about 300,000. So never since the 1973 Ramadan war, not even the 2006 conflict with Hezbollah, has Israel had to mobilize its military at such numbers. Israel has retaliated with airstrikes in Gaza, flattening tall buildings and striking the refugee camp of Jabalia and its main market. More than 500 Gazans, including nearly 40 children, have lost their lives and triple the number wounded. More than 800 Israelis have also been killed, including nearly 50 soldiers and officers. The Israeli Prime Minister and Defense Minister in their statements have vowed to decimate Hamas, even if it means destroying Gaza. A Wall Street Journal report says Iran helped Hamas plan its surprise attacks against Israel over the weekend, but Iran's mission to the United Nations has denied that. Meanwhile, US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has also said the US has no evidence as yet of Iran's involvement. Hezbollah in Lebanon has, however, clashed twice with Israelis, both in the Sheba Farms area as well as the Israel-Lebanon international border. Hezbollah has also said that it is not a neutral party in this conflict and has warned the US and Israel to stop with their foolishness. As we discuss this, the war is continuing, with human toll on both sides rising, especially in Gaza, which is without electricity, water, and natural gas and fuel supplies. We will, of course, discuss Israel's normalization with the Arab states, but in the context of the tragedy that is now unfolding in the occupied Palestinian territories. So let's dive right into our discussion. I have with me Mahjoob Zweiri, who's Professor of Contemporary History and Politics of the Middle East and Director of the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University, Dr. Aziz Alghashian, a Saudi scholar on Middle Eastern and Saudi politics. He has previously taught at the University of Essex, and Leila Hatoum, a Lebanese journalist and MENA expert. She has extensively covered MENA's hot zones and spiky issues over the past 2 decades, including the Arab-Israeli conflict, and was stationed along Lebanon's border during the 2006 Israeli aggression against Lebanon. Let me begin with Professor Zweiri here. Professor, before we get into what's happening, one of the problems, and I'm exclusively talking about the kind of narrative that comes out of the Western press, is to take a snapshot view of the situation rather than using a longitudinal design and saying, well, if something like this has happened, there must be a reason behind it. Let's trace that reason and see why over the last, 1967, one can go back to 48, the Palestinian Nakba, but let's take 67 as a benchmark. That's things have been happening, and those things obviously will result in the Palestinians defending themselves and trying to make the point that they, like any other peoples, need their dignity and their rights. So this narrative needs to be pushed back.
Thank you for the invitation. There is no doubt that the narrative that the West is trying to sell to the world since 1948 has to be stopped, it has to be, first of all, challenged and then maybe stopped. And from the day one on latest event on Saturday, my first comment on what's happening, that was what was happening in Gaza is a battle of image, is a battle of narrative and image. Both sides, they tried to fix the image and try to change the narrative. Of course, I mean, I can claim that Hamas that's a priority to it because of the situation they are living in. So that narrative you are saying, you're talking about, does not recognize the root cause of the problem, does not recognize the occupation, does not recognize the suffering of the Palestinians, does not recognize that the fact that Palestinians are the center of any discussion about normalization with the Arab world. That is what makes, just an hour ago, Jerusalem Post has published a news that Riyadh has informed Blinken that they end every negotiation about normalization with Israel. That is a reflection of what's happening. So that tells you that what the media in the West trying to do is escape forward and trying to say, okay, from this point we want to start. This is not right. This is not true, and that is what we face ourselves as an academic from the region and experts. When we talk to our colleagues in Europe and the United States, they want to pick and choose from where they can start the story. We tell them, no, we go back to the root. There is an occupation. According to 242, 338, this occupation should be ended. That is international law. You talk about international law. You talk about the human rights. You should recognize this. Even with the fact that some of us does not recognize the fact that Israel should exist, that something else can be decided from everyone case by case. But the fact that 242, 338 as a main reference, that talk about occupation. Arab Initiative in 2002 was very clear. We need peace, two things. Recognize the 242, 338 and go to 1967. That initiative has not been recognized by Israelis, has not been supported by the Western countries, including the United States. All of this narrative, ignoring the fact that there are millions of people are suffering. I mean, Israelis say today we are putting a blockade on Gaza. Already, let's say about the numbers. Since 1948, 100,000 Palestinians were killed by the Israelis. 8,000 prisoners, 8,000 plus prisoners, women, children, and men in the prisons of Israel now. What they need more suffering. People, they are already suffered. People, they are already exhausted. They want to do more. That want to do more. Reaction, any action will have reaction.
Absolutely. But here's my point, Professor Zweiri. Of course, we need to push back against this narrative, which obviously cherry picks events. The US president says US support for Israel is rock solid and unwavering, and Israel has every right to defend itself. But no one really talks about the fact that Palestinians, or any oppressed people for that matter, anywhere in the world, also have the right to defend themselves. Now, I have a sense that this is not an unwitting omission. This is deliberate because, we all know that two of Netanyahu's ministers, the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, illegal settler, the national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is again an illegal settler, who has actually been indicted for hate speech, who used to have the portrait of Baruch Goldstein, who massacred Palestinians in his drawing room. And then, forget about these ministers. Just last month, the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, went to the United Nations with a map of Israel, which he brandished there. And in that map, he showed all the Palestinian occupied territories as part of Israel. Now, the question really is that in the face of these very clear, evidences for the West, or at least some people in the West or the Western governments, to try and push the narrative that they've been trying to push since Hamas fighters took everyone by surprise, I seem to, get a sense, a very strong sense, that this is deliberate. This is not an unwitting omission.
Of course, because this is how they explain, and this is how they justify their interest. Of course, this is I agree with you 100%. It is planned. It's considered based on the interest. Otherwise, why the United States made all of those statements in the last 48 hours? Why the French president comes and say we will send support? Why the Prime Minister of the UK today made a statement that he will send military support to the Israelis? That's obvious. That's obvious. They don't recognize the right of the Palestinians. The whole argument of Benjamin Netanyahu that peace can be made with the Arabs and then demolish Palestinians, just make them never exist. What happened on Saturday actually ended that narrative, actually ended forever. No one can talk about normalization, even if they want to normalize Arab countries, without talking about Palestinians. Even if they want to mislead them, that's good for them. But even they have to bring them to a discussion. They have to talk about them, and that's what made actually the discussion about even possible normalization with Riyadh discussing, because Riyadh made it very clear: no discussion about normalization unless there is discussion about Palestinian issue, and that was different from Abraham Accord, where the discussion about security and Iran and all of these things. One final point I had, just if you allow me to make it quickly. There is no doubt that the issue of normalization and having a good ties with Israel has been approved since 1978. That Arabs and Palestinians have not benefited from that even penny, and actually they lost a lot. You look, for example, there is the first report about the Israelis' loss of what happened now. They will lose around $100 billion if this war continues, that they themselves announced it. They will lose because the oil, the gas deals with Jordan and Egypt will be affected. There will be a problem. The economy of Palestinians is relying on the economy of Israel relying on the Palestinians. They will lose around $50 billion if this war continues. All of the small business will suffering. Most important thing, the image of Israel as being the main provider of an amazing technology, amazing spy technology, now has been a question. Now people will say, good for you. You are spying on people on big cell. Now good, people, they came to you, and yesterday and today there are reports saying we don't know from where they come. They replace their forces. They replaced their forces yesterday, as there is no state exists on the ground. These are a big question. This ramification will affect the normalization, the peace process, having ties with Israel, the image of Israel, internal politics of Israel. It is an earthquake, in a summary.
Absolutely. Quickly, for the viewers, one of the points that Professor Zweiri talked about, the U.S. support, the USS Gerald Ford, which is the U.S. Navy's newest and most advanced aircraft carrier, and it approximately has 5,000 sailors and deck of warplanes. It's accompanied, like all carrier groups, by cruisers and destroyers. It is being moved closer to Israel through the Mediterranean, essentially, possibly for interdicting additional weapons from reaching Hamas. Now, what I'm going to do, since Professor Zweiri has to leave, I'm going to do a quick round with Leila and Aziz, and then come back to Professor Zweiri before he leaves the program. Leila, Professor Zweiri talked about the narrative, and I think that's very important. Now, this is an era of cell phones, handheld gizmos, essentially citizen journalists, and everyone is recording. So it's like the war is actually happening in two dimensions, if not three dimensions, in front of you. Now, given that the Western governments, as I said earlier also, given that the Western governments are pushing a certain kind of narrative, and it's not an unwitting omission, it's a deliberate policy, how much of a difference can the Arab world and the Muslim world make in terms of denting this narrative, or at least in terms of winning enough adherence, if not with the Western governments, then with the Western societies, where people say enough is enough, this has been going on for too long, and actually put some pressure on their governments to change the policy.
True. It's not only basically the Western world, but also the Israeli Hasbara, the Israeli Electronic Army from day one, from the first moment. They tried to change the narrative and portray, because at one point, from the very early beginning, when Hamas infiltrated and actually succeeded to go into the enclave settlements, the whole world was in shock, but they were in awe as well, because it was a scenario of David versus Goliath, right? So they garnered respect at one point. This merited that the Israeli Hasbara attack this image viciously and try to find gaps in the narrative to use it against them in a campaign of disinformation. They waited until the first mistake was made on the ground. Hamas, at one point or another, with their military media, this is the first time that they take their military media deep into the fights, and they were shooting videos of everything that's happening. So they were shooting videos that they are not targeting children or elderly, that basically they're not fighting against women unless basically women soldiers are fighting against them, and that they're only fighting soldiers and reservists, irrespective. So they were showing us how they're not hitting or harming elderly and children and mothers. But unfortunately, there was a mistake that happened when they caught one of the Israeli soldiers, and they had to strip search everybody because they might have tracking devices. So her body was partially naked. It was shown on the video. The Palestinians were very angry over decades of oppression. Some of them spat on the dead body. This is a mistake, and this is condemned by everybody, including in Islam. However, the Israeli media took it, and they changed the narrative into this girl is German, and she's a tourist, and she came for a peace festivity near the Gaza border. Now, let's see. How did the world react to that? Particularly, not only Arabs, but also some sympathizers with Hamas from the Western world. They dug deep into the narrative, and they found out that this girl is also an Israeli soldier. She's an Israeli citizen. At the same time, the festivity near the enclave, basically near Gaza Strip, you can't have peace next to the world's largest open-air prison. You have crammed 2 million Palestinians over there. You ration their water intake. You ration their food intake. You ration their electricity intake. They can't breathe. If you want to rebuild something inside Gaza Strip, you have to wait for the Israeli permission to have the construction material to go in. So they have been censored for over 16 years harshly. So I really laugh about the narrative that they say, like, we're going to impose full, basically, seize and Gaza. It has been under that for the past 15 to 16 years. This is one of the narratives that they're playing. So the international community, the Arab community, and the Muslim community can actually dig into the narratives and fight the disinformation campaign. Why I call it disinformation and not fake news? Because the Israelis and the Western media, and there are over 80,000 accounts from India alone that are helping the Israelis as well. And this is what you know.
Oh, this is that. I didn't want to get into that because as a Pakistani, I didn't want to bring in that.
I can say
but we have actually been tracking those, and those are actually Hindutva BJP affiliated handles that have been cheering the Israelis on. But of course, I'm going to return to you.
Go into that narrative. Those people created a campaign of disinformation whereby basically they take some facts and then they feed it with fake news. So it's fake news covered with some facts, and then they feed it to the world. They were trying to have the Western world sympathize that there's a European that was killed. She was a tourist. She was a civilian. No, she wasn't a civilian. She was a soldier, and she was Israeli. And she had posted her own Israeli passport back in 2016 on her own Instagram page. So this mistake slipped, and it was their fatal mistake. People don't buy that narrative anymore. Unfortunately, we see some Arabs fighting that narrative. They continue to spread that Hamas operatives are raping women and killing children. Until now, as a reporter on the ground, and I have correspondents on the ground, not a single evidence of Hamas fighters killing children or raping women has emerged. So this is a campaign of disinformation to change the narrative of David versus Goliath.
This was something that Fareed Zakaria asked Mr. Barghouti on his program, and he completely dismissed this. But Aziz, there is another thing also, since Leila has brought this up. The settlers, the illegal settlers, are armed for the most part. They kill the Palestinians at will. They demolish their homes. They are like marauders. We've seen this in the West Bank, and they are supported by the Israeli security forces. And so it's very easy to say that certain civilians have gotten killed, but it's very difficult to justify that those civilians can be reservists, those civilians can be those illegal settlers with weapons. And therefore, I also want to get your take on this war of narratives, which Professor Zweiri talked about. And I know that he has spoken about this on Al Jazeera also. He's been making this point constantly. I think it's a very, very important point.
Yes. Well, firstly, it's good to join you all. And just allow me to start. I think it's also very important and crucial to say that there is never a justification to take innocent life. And
Correct.
I think we have to always say this, and we hope the entire world can be consistent with that. Because while we always will stand against people that will target innocent life, unfortunately, some innocent lives matter more than other innocent lives. And this is how it's being perceived by others. And when it comes to this idea of narrative, this narrative, this is part of the narrative. This is part of, I think, a narrative that's not being seen, that I think more and more people are beginning to start to see and pay attention to, is that there is, unfortunately, a great deal of contradiction. That if some innocent people lose their lives, it's more important than other innocent lives. And this is something that we have to tackle. And I also want to say this while we're on here. I know this is a very tense and turbulent situation, but this is something that many people in the region, be it Sunni, Shia, be it Saudi, be it Iranian, Arab, and Israeli, all agree on. So there is like-mindedness out there. It's just, unfortunately, it's the discourse of the extremists that seem to be attracting a lot more of this attention. And so that has to be, I think, in my opinion, that's what I would like to start off with. And I think it's important also to understand how this situation is being looked at. For me, what I don't accept is the fact that this is some sort of isolated event, that what has happened is just something that just came out of the blue. I think for many people that have been working towards peace, really dedicating themselves towards peace, will be so disheartened, and because they've been calling for something to be done on this front. And the fact that people have been warning, and you could even see that in the Saudi statements. The Saudi statement even suggested that, hey, there's something simmering here. The dynamics of this occupation is leading to a very explosive situation that is taking.
I'm gonna come to that, Aziz. I just want to go back to Professor Zweiri because he has to leave. It's important. In fact, the point that you have made is very important because there are discerning Israelis. I was on a program yesterday in which I started by saying that we make a clear distinction between Jewish faith and Israel and the Israeli policies. So because this has now become a tendency in Israel that anyone who criticizes the policies of the Israeli government are immediately branded as anti-Semite. And I think this is a point, this is a distinction that needs to be made as also part of a pushback against this kind of narrative. There are Israelis, like I was listening to Gideon Levy, I've been reading him, Daniel Levy, the late Yuri Avneri, his entire Gush Shalom and everything. So there are very discerning, sensible Israeli citizens who have been saying that this is, as you said, simmering, which is a very apt term, and this is the dynamics of this will obviously at some point explode. But Professor Zweiri, March 2022, the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territories talked about political system of entrenched rule in the occupied West Bank and Gaza. The report said that this satisfies the prevailing evidentiary standard for the existence of apartheid. Now, in November, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to advocate housing reached the same conclusion in relation to Israel's policy of home demolition. In October, the United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the OPTs, including East Jerusalem and Israel, concluded that the occupation of the OPT is unlawful due to its permanence and Israel's measure to annex Palestinian land in law and practice. And it goes on because, the Amnesty International, even the Israeli Supreme Court has actually, unfortunately, accepted measures which are clearly violative of the peace agreement. Now, one of the questions is that PLO made a peace agreement with Israel. That peace agreement has not led to anywhere. You got A areas, you've got B areas, you've got C areas, and the Israeli security forces work with impunity in the B areas where there's a Palestinian Authority civil control. So the question is that if peace is not going to get the Palestinians anything, and when they pick up arms to defend themselves, they are equally condemned. So it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Well, I think there is no doubt that Israelis insist on the fact that what's so-called international law, international, even common sense, are not really respected. I mean, they know that there's very clear resolutions about occupation, but they have never respected that. Arabs, they went there despite the fact that Arab governments, they went and they know that their own public are not happy of this. They went with the flowers to the Israelis saying, just accept 242,338 and stop on 1967, we will be happy. They rejected to admit. Actually, they become more radical on their position towards the Arab countries in particular. I have to differentiate between Arab public opinion and Arab people and the Arab governments, because Arab public opinion, Arab people, they are anti peace with Israel, anti normalization with Israel, because this have not led to anything. 30,000 Egyptians they traveled to Egypt since 1978. How many Jordanians? Maybe less than that. So there is no serious peace as they claim when it comes to it. There is I would say in security elements there is collaboration, there are things, but there is no serious peace because Israelis are very living there and the Arabs living down in terms of economy, in terms of technology and everything. And Israelis, even to the French, does not even give them technology they needed. So I think Israelis, everyone knows this, and they rely on this, on the power, on the force. They have the power, they have the technology, they have the economy, very strong economy. If they have a problem, they have the phone number they can call, and then the weapon will come and the money will come. So they have this kind of understanding, and I think now they are trying to capitalize on this. What happened now, trying to get more support from the Europe and the United States, and I think the moment is very different. This is a moment where America and the Europe are involved in Ukraine. They are exhausted, they are tired, their economy is suffering. I'm not sure that this time it will be like previous times. There is also a few things we have to bring when we talk about the region. Extremism, or so-called extremism or radical view in the region, is a reflect of as unfairness, is a reflect of injustice, is a reflect of bad governance, is a reflection of corruption, and all of this, they were in favor of Israel. Bad governance in favor of Israel, because the government does not listen to the people, but they have the support from outsiders if they get peace with Israel. They don't care about people, their own people, but they care about the legitimacy from outside. When you talk about corruption, the same. When you talk about bad governance, I mean, just give you an example. When you talk about, for example, aid, humanitarian aid, or development to help countries, aid to the countries. Previously, a lot of countries, they used to pay to Arab countries money, cash to the account, and then they found that the money is gone. Now that Japan, even a country like Saudi Arabia, now they don't give money to the neighboring country. They tell them, what's the project? You want school? Give us where is the land? We build the school. Why? Because people, they realize that there is a level of corruption cannot be tackled. So the best way to help people is to have projects. In case of Iraq, in case of Syria, the same. So because of all of this, Israelis is becoming the 191 to any country has a problem. So I will go to peace with Israel, then I can be, I remain in power. That itself brings Israelis to every little discussion in each family in the region. When it comes to electricity, when it comes to water, when it comes to food, when it comes to jobs, when it comes to human rights, when it comes to democratization, with all of those issues, Israelis are there in a way or other. Because if you have a democratization, you will have governments who are not really good with Israel. If you have a democratization, you will have anti-corruption movements. If you have human rights, what happened to a lot of people in different Arab countries will never happen because of this. So it's obvious that the occupation itself is the root cause of a disastrous situation in the region. And as long as there is no real determination to discuss it, to break it down and say, okay, it's not about Palestine, it's about every Arab country neighboring to Palestine. So this issue takes us to the point that ignoring the fact that there is an occupation, ignoring the fact that there are millions of people are suffering, ignoring the fact there is a serious injustice in the region, no one will have peace. That's obvious. I mean, previously it was said, and it seems what happened this Saturday is another evidence that no one will have peace unless there is a serious debate about about justice, about real development, people they can live in peace and also prosperity.
Absolutely. One final question before I let you go, Professor Zweiri.
Yeah.
Given the situation, how do you see this unfolding? Because one of the things that we've seen is that the Israeli military is now hell-bent on flattening Gaza. There's the likelihood of a ground offensive also. So, how is it going to unfold? And how do you perceive Hezbollah in the next 24 to 48 hours responding to what's happening in Gaza?
This is the war of Benjamin Netanyahu and his alliances. He will not stop until he manage to come back with different narrative to the Israelis. Now, if he comes back, the first question will come to him from the government. You are the problem. You get us to this because of what you have done in the last few years. So he's escaping from questioning his governance in Israel by waging this kind of this war. Now, there is no small evidence says that he will gain anything from this. He's doing this assuming that statement will come, a military Hamas was a leader was killed or a political leader was killed, to come back to the people and say, I have achieved something. Of course, he can destroy Gaza. Of course, he can kill as much as he can. But this will not, dismiss the fact that Gaza was in this hell for a long time, and the hell is increasing. So there is no new in what he was doing. More important, every war, Israelis enter or military operation, Hamas actually come out stronger and comes more sophisticated and become more people, they are supporting Hamas more, and they gain more support from people. So what I see the situation now is that they will give him, Americans, Europeans, they will give Netanyahu some time, do whatever you want, but in some time he will have to stop it because the price will be high, because there will be internal debate in America about the casualties in Gaza. And Biden doesn't want to lose. there will be a real debate in the West about what's happening in Gaza. Okay, the discussion will be, the narrative will be, okay, Hamas made a mistake. You are repeating the mistake. This will be the narrative in a matter of 10 days. Okay, you want to follow up. You call Hamas terrorist organization. You want to become a terrorist. So this will be the narrative in 10 days. What Hezbollah is basically trying to gain more support and legitimacy in the region after what is done in Syria. Hezbollah lost its own legitimacy and support in the Arab street, and now he's trying to say, I'm back. I'm not sure this will have a real impact, but this is an attempt to link what's happening in Gaza with southern Lebanon. Hezbollah is facing a real challenge inside Lebanon. It's no longer popular in Lebanon. People, they ask Hezbollah not to intervene in this war because they say Lebanon is collapsed already. We don't need more problems. So I think there will be pressure from within on Hezbollah. But again, every party tries to gain points so they can say to its own base, I have done something.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Zweiri, for being with us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Aziz, the point that Professor Zweiri spoke about, the Arab street populations and the Arab governments. Now, one of the things that Netanyahu was trying to do was to make the Palestinians irrelevant and to reach out and normalize with Arab governments. And Riyadh is the most important capital in that regard.
Yeah.
Now, how do you suppose this unfolding conflict will impact that?
Well, I think, quite frankly, not only did the fighting and this backdrop is very difficult to achieve any kind of normalization deal, because the normalization deal already in itself was incredibly difficult to achieve anyway. I mean, it was incredibly difficult to achieve on the best of days, on the best of time. There needed to be there's a lot of moving parts, and they all needed to be aligned in the same time. Now, what I think is very difficult here is for two main reasons. Firstly, sticking with this framework of the normalization, which is that required Palestinian concessions to Palestinians too, in order to be the platform of a legitimacy for Saudi-Israeli normalization. There had to be some sort of a component that will legitimize this relationship. Now, with this current government, that was very difficult to see. And I think with the turbulence now is very difficult to see any kind of talks of concessions. Secondly, which I think is more overarchingly, is the fact that Netanyahu elevated this to a war. And the fact that Saudi Arabia will normalize relations with Israel against the backdrop of an Arab-Israeli war is very, very, I mean, I can't say impossible, but it's just very, I mean, it's unfathomable. It's very difficult.
So basically what you're saying is that this is not just a speed bump. It is much more than that. Especially if casualties begin to mount in Gaza, they are already mounting.
Yeah.
We have statements by the Israeli defense minister, the Israeli prime minister, saying more or less, basically, they're saying that we are going to destroy Gaza.
Yeah.
If in order to decimate Hamas, essentially, the implication is that even if we have to kill everyone in trying to decimate Hamas, we will do that. Now, that is such a horrific scenario that, you're absolutely right that the the Saudi-Israeli normalization, even on the best day, was not going to be, given many moving parts, was not going to be easy. But with this in the backdrop, and if it continues as it is likely to, it's going to be very, very difficult. I agree with you.
Yeah, it's very difficult, and this is the situation. Just a few words of just the nature of Saudi foreign policy towards Israel. the nature, I've been researching about this topic and been arguing that the nature of Saudi policy towards Israel is one of passivity, not proactivity. And a lot of people like to think and make to say, and hey, no, they're always like, they try to go towards each other. The Saudi position of Israel is always never too close, but never too far as well. And it is precisely not too close for these kinds of situations. This is precisely it, is that when things happen, because they will happen, they will happen. And if, just to expand upon what Professor Marwan Mahjoob said, it will happen because the Palestinian issue and the conflict has not been addressed at its core. And, all this talk about normalization and normalizing relations with Israel and GCC states and other Arab states, what is also overly normalized is the conflict. So what we have to do in moving forward is to denormalize the Palestinian conflict, because it's become so normalized and so naturalized in many people's lives that it's becoming that almost when I would bring up the issue of saying, listen, there's a pressure cooker taking place. There's something happening here. Along with, I'm learning from Palestinian colleagues and I'm learning from Israeli colleagues. And this is why it's important to keep an open mind and listen to others. And then they're saying, listen, the way we are going is conducive to a massive explosion. What that explosion looks like, we don't know. And now we're starting to see, and it's not the end of it. This is why, and I am afraid that we have reached a juncture in this conflict that is irreversible.
Absolutely, I think that's a great insight. Leila, two similar questions for you. One, of course, since you are in Lebanon, with reference to Hezbollah, do you agree with what Professor Zweiri was saying? And secondly, again, the issue of how this is likely to unfold.
I'll start by addressing the issue of Hezbollah's popularity in Lebanon. It's true. After basically Hezbollah took part in the Syrian war, they were invited officially by the government in Syria. So that made them a mercenary group that went into Syria, because they're not Syrian to fight the Syrian war. They were fighting somebody else's war based on an invitation. So it's different from fighting an occupation on your own land, whereas basically everybody had to tolerate them. If they didn't like them, they had to tolerate them at one point or another, because they were local group fighting against an occupation that basically tortures Lebanese, threatens Lebanese all the time, and they continue to do so. When they stepped outside Lebanon, that's when they started spreading their feathers. They thought themselves, basically, they are bigger than their own government. And that create some sensitivities inside Lebanon, especially to the groups who kind of follow other countries that are anti-Iran, which supports Hezbollah. So they started taking Hezbollah's participation in the Syrian war as a context to voice their opposition to Hezbollah. Sounding an opposition to Hezbollah has been increasing over the past few years, including when Hezbollah went into Yemen war over sectarian reasons rather than basically being officially invited by a government over there. So the idea is that they have lost their popularity. However, I don't believe that them fighting the Israelis now or supporting Hamas is to garner more support internally, because people don't care anymore. So they don't care about the public opinion in Lebanon. They think they are bigger than Lebanon. They are being supported, financed, and even dealt arms by Iran, among other nations that support them. So they don't care that much. When it comes to them fighting alongside Hamas, I don't think they're going to take that step too soon. They're very smart, they're very calculative. They've learned from the mistakes that they've done in 2006 war. And I don't know if you remember, the first reporter to ask Nasrallah during that press conference he held in 2006, after they basically captured those two Israeli soldiers, it was me. I asked him, don't you think that the Israelis were preparing for an entrapment situation? Because they have moved all their battalions to the Lebanese borders, basically to the northern Israeli front. And he laughed it off. 15 days after the war broke out, he went out to say, oh, we received documents that proves that the Israelis were preparing for war. And I'm like basically half his age. I was monitoring the situation. I don't even fight on the borders. And I saw it. Couldn't you see it? It's because they were so centralized on the borders, they couldn't see the bigger picture at one point. They changed the rules of engagement after that. So when it comes to them fighting against the Israelis now, going into Palestinian war, I highly doubt it will happen unless there's a push from the Iranians. At the end of the day, the person who
Yeah.
financed
So that's an important point. That's an important point, and I want to pull in Aziz on
they
this.
might go, but the idea is that there were lots of reports that they actually infiltrated the northern Israeli settlements. It didn't happen. I was there. I came down. Hezbollah did not issue a statement saying that we infiltrated. They usually brag about it. So far, it's basically its information campaign.
Right. So Aziz, Hamas, we know for some time now, has a liaison office with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And Hamas has also publicly stated, and it's not now, they've stated it a while ago, about support from Iran and their linkages with Iran. And with the Hezbollah linkages, some of the capabilities that we have seen in this fight are fairly similar to what we have seen with Hezbollah fighters. And so it seems that at least to the extent of some kind of, planning or some kind of, doctrinal sharing, if not joint training or interoperability, there is something there which Hamas has learned from Hezbollah. Is that something that you would agree with?
I'll be very honest with you. I'm not really a massive expert on Hamas or Hezbollah, so I very much yield to Leila for her expertise on this. But what I would say, because I think you mentioned on the Iranian situation, is that, and what I do want to expand upon on what Leila's analysis and her insights suggests, is that, they may be called barbarians, they may be called violent, they may be called this, but they're not stupid. And this is the situation. This is what makes the situation even more dangerous, is that they understand how to calculate their conflict and calculate the entrance into the conflict. And what they do is that they want to make sure that Israel is there because Israel is precisely the legitimacy that they have. Fighting Israel is the very legitimacy they have for their audiences. So as a result, there needs to be this kind of discourse that constantly calls for the decimation of Israel, while at the same time not really doing not very much doing what they claim to be doing. And this is where we're starting to see now, and more broadly, the cycle of violence here. And it's really the cycle of extremism, because I think, in my opinion, this is what they give each other political oxygen. It's Ben Gvir, it goes with Nasrallah, and it goes with people, and it goes back again. And then it goes back to the aspect of narrative. Unfortunately, aspect of conflict and polarizations is far more resonant for the layman than peace and discussion and nuance. And so this is what gains traction from people, and not really those that, I think, according to be honest, an Israeli friend of mine who said, we are conspirators of peace, as in we're actually, the idea of being a conspirator of peace, that, it was really, it hit me, because it said, now it's not very exciting to be someone to talk about peace. It's actually more exciting to talk about violence and what they're going to do and how things are. It's easy to do that. It's hard to be someone who's trying to be nuanced in this. And that's what I think what is incumbent upon us is really trying to be as much nuanced. But I think what we see here is this is what perpetuates the cyclical aspect.
Yeah.
And it's giving these people political oxygen.
It becomes a dispiriting cycle. I completely agree with you. But Leila, you see, now as the situation is unfolding, we're going to see more violence. But my question to you is that there was a time in the run-up to the Oslo process also, and after the Oslo process also, there was a sizable peace lobby within Israel, especially on the left and left of center parties. But over the years, we have seen very clearly that lobby has been marginalized. And it's reached a point where you people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, as important portfolios as finance and national security, as part of the Israeli cabinet, and the rise of not just these but also religious Zionist parties and the rest. Given the kind of violence that has been unleashed now, do you think it is likely to, sort of play to the advantage of the peace lobby in Israel, or is it going to actually strengthen the extremists in Israel?
This is a very important question, and basically it's a strong note. And I have to say that ever since Benjamin Netanyahu came into power, late 1990s, early 2000, until today, he worked as a weasel. Before that, you had Israeli military leaders taking part in politics. They knew what was at stake, they knew how to act, and they knew when to retreat. And those people actually knew how to negotiate when it came to peace process. They were not going to implement the Oslo agreements. They deferred it from 1996 to 1998. They were supposed to withdraw from the occupied Palestinian territories. We continue to call them occupied Palestinian territories according to the United Nations because the Israelis continue to occupy them. 30 years after signing the Oslo agreements, and they had agreed to leave them. They haven't. So those generals knew how to take things bit by bit and push the narrative irrespective. When it came to civilians taking power, true, Netanyahu was one of the conscripts. He was a soldier, he fought, etc. But he is not an army general. He doesn't have that mentality. He's a politician and he's a businessman. And he's corrupt. He had been tried for corruption several times, him and his wife. Irrespective, this person gave power to the smaller right-wing groups and far-right groups. He allied with them to form governments so he can beat the opposition at one point or another. So he fed power into them. Those people had basically a power position to speak to other people and bring people to their narrative.
Thank you for this information. But I have to close the program also now. So, Aziz, the same question, whether it's gonna somehow the peace lobby will manage to sort of strengthen itself, or whether we're looking at the extremists getting extremely strengthened in Israel.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think when it comes to, for example, the peace camp during the early 90s, just before Oslo, I mean, they were sizable, but there was also a sizable opposition to this. I mean, it's also worth remembering that in that process of trying to negotiate something, Ishaq Rabin was assassinated by an extremist settler. And so this is a very dangerous situation that they have. But there was a peace camp, and that in my opinion, while again, I'm as someone who studies Saudi foreign policy towards Israel, this is my angle, so I'm not a real expert in this, but I will share my insights, my humble insights. At the core of this of their peace process, the peace logic, the foundation was security. The fact that they were saying that we need to solve this situation on the Palestinian front, not really for the sake of the Palestinian, it's for the sake of security for us. Because what we don't want is something that's what's happening now, and it's not good for our security. And in some ways, that's very strategic and pragmatic, because that will gain the resonance on the streets on the Israeli streets. Now, they became to decrease as time went, and for different reasons. Some of them is because of the difficulties and the clashes and the conflict itself. It just became too unappetizing to reach a deal with the Palestinians. Another aspect is demographics. Within Israel, people of a particular disposition, a religious disposition that didn't vote before, that refused to vote because of their religious kind of affiliation or dispositions, began to start voting, and this then naturally made it go to the right. And what happened here is because of Netanyahu's corruption and his lack of trustworthiness every coalition he would go into, the main parties have ceased to deal with him, with the exception of these extremists. So that's the situation that we're starting to see.
One
Israeli colleague suggested something. He said the current Palestinian-Israeli conflict before this was in its most dangerous because it was manageable. When it wasn't big enough for people to say, hey, let's go and do something about it. At the same time, it wasn't small enough for people to change their minds on the situation. And it was in that it was in the worst place it can be. So I hope, we're all now thinking about the horizons. Many people are probably saying, Hamas is very bad, of course, and this cannot be denied. But many people are saying, that they're terrorists, but so was the PLO. They were considered terrorists.
Yeah, absolutely.
And all of a sudden, this situation happened. So there is no substitute for a political horizon. There just isn't.
Yeah, but the way I see it, and you've actually explained it very well. A lot of this will also depend on Israel's domestic politics. It'll depend on Netanyahu, who is a survivor, doesn't really want to be out of power. And a lot of the choices that he will make will link up with what the right wing wants. Yeah. So there's going to be a symbiotic relationship between Netanyahu's desire to stay in power and the desire of the right wing for a certain kind of agenda to be pushed. And I think, sure. But
it will be hard for anybody to come back. It will be very hard for anybody to come back from this, including Netanyahu. When you have thousands of Israelis injured and killed, that's massive. And the public opinion in Israel does not have mercy on its own politicians. And history showed us that in the past. They have toppled governments. They have put people in prison. When you actually tamper with the public opinion will come back more viciously against you. That's one thing. The second thing is that Israel cannot sustain a long-term war. Throughout its history, it has been doing fast strikes. So like the maximum war is about 5 to 7 weeks. That's it. In 2006, after the third week, and I remember it very well because I was covering it on the ground, they were asking the United Nations to intervene to actually stop the war and call for truce. The Lebanese had refused that at one point. Then when they wanted to patch things up, the Americans intervened and they created an air bridge from Washington directly to Israel, to Tel Aviv, sending them weapons and missiles and two-ton bombs, and told them continue with the war and use these bombs that we gave you. They gave them new bombs that they tested on us. So the idea is that the Israelis cannot conscript their own people for the longest time, because that means they will shut down their economy, farmlands, the bourse, other businesses, etc. Most of the conscripts work across the economic sector, and also they can't stop.
I mean, that happened like 50 years ago in the Ramadan War also. I mean, one of the biggest airlifts of weapons and equipment that was sent by the US to Israel. But it's really interesting. Since I have to close this, every indication. Like, Thorne Wennesland, who's the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, he told the UN Security Council in August this year that escalating violence is being fueled by growing despair about the future among Palestinians and a lack of progress towards achieving an independent state. So none of this, it's not like it's just suddenly happened and no one, I mean, you could say that you've been surprised by the timing or the suddenness of Hamas's attack, but no one should be surprised that something like this has actually happened, because it's been simmering for such a long time.
Yeah.
But thank you so much.
We do have historic incidents. The Warsaw Uprising in 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.
Absolutely.
The Nazis put the Jews into 3 small ghettos. The largest was 4 kilometers square. They crammed hundreds of thousands of people over there. That ended up in an explosion of an uprising against the Nazis in Poland. The same thing happened with Gaza. You crammed 2 million people in a very small strip. You bar it from doing anything. You bar people from breathing or living. that leads to an explosion. So the explosion was expected. The scale was the surprise. The way that they enforced it was the surprise. It was out of question. I mean, like nobody expected the Palestinians to fly over the wall.
Oh, yeah, that was actually a very interesting innovation. But thank you so much, Leila. Always a pleasure to have you with me. Thank you, Aziz. Again, it's great to have you on the program. As far as this particular episode is concerned, this is all that we could discuss in the limited time that we have. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. That helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.